And we are live on Facebook as well. Joining me via Zoom right now. Very, very topical conversation. A conversation, in actual fact, that could save you and also maybe someone attached to you, someone that is indeed close to you. This has been a somewhat raging conversation. For some reason, this hasn't been a topic of conversation for some time, and now it's coming to the fore very, very significantly, coming up just before we're hitting the month of December, of course, with the 16 days of activism. But before we get into any of that, on the 30th of September in 2024, the Pretoria High Court handed down a judgment declaring certain provisions in the Sexual Offence Act unconstitutional for failing to protect GBVF victims against legal bias in favour of perpetrators. Very interesting. Joining me right now, it is Leanne Germanos. She's the director and co-founder of the organisation called the Embrace Project. She joins me on the line now. Leanne, firstly, to you, good afternoon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I look forward to chatting to you about this topic.
No, absolutely. So let's get straight into it. Let's start at the very beginning. Now, the Embrace Project recently challenged the constitutionality of rape and consent definitions within the Sexual Offences Act. So before this got challenged, what were the definitions of rape and consent according to the Act?
So according to the Act, Section 3 was the section or the provision in the Sexual Offences Act that defined rape. But just to clarify, it's not just rape that we actually sort of challenged and that got declared unconstitutional. It was rape and a number of other sexual offences, but this is the definition for rape.
Yeah.
It is any person who unlawfully and intentionally commits an act of sexual penetration with a complainant without the consent of the complainant is guilty of the offence of rape.
Okay.
And consent was also defined as follows. For purposes of what they call consent-based sexual offences, and then it lists a whole number of sections in the Sexual Offences Act, consent means voluntary or uncoerced agreement. So leaves it quite broad, the meaning of consent. And what we did with our case is we asked the court not only to declare certain provisions in the Sexual Offences Act unconstitutional, and that was actually really based on a very specific element in each of these provisions that were declared unconstitutional, and that was the element of criminal intent.
Yeah. So
what we then asked the court to do, and which they did, was they read in the following provision. So now the court and the law requires the following. Whenever an accused person is charged with an offence under the Sexual Offences Act, it is not a valid defence for that accused person to rely on a subjective belief that the complainant was consenting to the conduct in question. They must take objectively reasonable steps to ascertain that the complainant consented to that sexual conduct.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so, I mean, part of this is obviously where you believe that the Act then really protect the perpetrators more than the victims of any sort of sexual offence. But now all of that is being flipped on its head to, I suppose, then really support the victims now more than what it would support the perpetrators.
I wouldn't say that at all, actually. I would say the Act now balances out the rights of victims, their right to freedom and security and safety, as well as the right of the accused person for a fair trial, to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. So finally, it actually balances out the scales as opposed to saying that it leans now more towards the victims.
I got you. So what exactly made the Embrace Project then take this on? I know earlier on you mentioned that it was a case. Do you just want to elaborate on that for me?
Sure. So it was actually a very brave GBVF survivor who approached our organization and told us about her rape case and her experience in the criminal justice system. That her rape case went to trial, and the magistrate found that her accused had committed an act of sexual penetration which was unlawful and in a situation where she did not consent, but the magistrate couldn't convict her perpetrator because the magistrate couldn't find that the state had proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused person had intended to
Mm,
commit this rape. And that's exactly what we challenged, this criminal intent question that I alluded to a bit earlier.
yeah, and obviously now the scales are being balanced, as what you were mentioning earlier. But if I'm not mistaken, this is the second case, I think, and I do speak under correction. I think the first time this was challenged on your end was back in, was it 2020, 2021, if I'm not mistaken?
So it's actually the same challenge, as surprisingly. So we launched our challenge in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we sent a letter to the presidency. Then we launched this particular litigation in 2022, and the High Court only managed to hear it this year in
Wow.
2024, 2 years later.
Sure.
And
Wow.
it's still not the end of the road, actually. We still have to get this confirmed by the Constitutional Court, which will likely take potentially another 2 years.
Well, I mean, so that was my next question. I mean, as the Embrace Project, Leanne, where do you go from here? Because obviously, when you say this is, when you call this a massive win, I suppose it's a massive win because there's actually some great movement now on this. So what is next, and where do you go from here?
So, exactly like I mentioned a bit earlier, this declaration of unconstitutionality, if a high court, or in other words, a lower court, declares provisions in an act unconstitutional, it must then still be confirmed by the Constitutional Court in order for it to actually result in a change in the law.
Mm,
And when that happens, for the first time ever in our law, we will no longer have to rely on an accused person's subjective belief, which, by the way, can be super unreasonable. The threshold for subjective belief is very low. It just needs to be reasonably possibly true,
yeah.
even though a reasonable person in the place of the accused would never have come to the conclusion that consent was given or believed that consent was given to them. And for the first time, we won't have to apply the resistance requirement, which means, victims have to either shout, scream, or push an accused person off them in order to prove to the court that the accused person knew they weren't consenting.
Sure.
Because now they have to take objectively reasonable steps to
Wow.
ascertain that consent.
Sure. Just having this conversation, I think, as a South African that doesn't operate within this legal parameters or that doesn't operate within the sector, we often don't realize how intense it really is when it comes to any sort of sexual offense.
Mhm.
I think up until this point, I didn't realize that it could be this difficult for survivors and often victims to even get any sort of justice from our legal system and from the perpetrators as well.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're lucky enough to have your case go to court, I mean, that's already the first hurdle. I think only about 3,000 rape cases went to court this year, so were prosecuted out of about 40,000 that were reported to
Sure.
the police. So you really have to be among the
Mm,
lucky to have your case heard, by our courts. And then you have to relive the trauma
yeah.
only to potentially, and fairly high potential,
Yeah.
have your case thrown out or the perpetrator acquitted because you didn't behave as a victim should. In other
Wow.
words, you didn't scream or kick.
I see.
And the amici, yeah, and the amici actually in our application put forward some scientific evidence which showed that 70% of victims actually freeze
Yeah.
when they're faced with sexual assault. They
Mm.
don't kick or scream. That is not the common reaction.
Wow. Okay. So listen, Leanne, as we come to close, very very interesting topic that we are discussing here. So as we do come to a close this afternoon, and as you've spoken about how the scales are now being balanced between perpetrators and victims, and giving both sides a fair chance, because we also understand that sometimes the victim is not the victim. Sometimes it's really just lies. So it's really just balancing the scales and giving both the opportunity to adequately speak about what really transpired. Do you think that now that the scales are being balanced, so to say, that there is a potential that if this individual is indeed guilty, that more individuals who are indeed perpetrators will be sentenced, and that we won't have this fear of one out of 1,000 opportunities?
That's the hope, really. The hope is that going forward, it will be a bit easier for the state to be able to convict accused persons where it's very clear that there was no consent given. And I'm also hoping, in addition to an increase in the number of convictions, that there'll also be an increase in the number of prosecutions. So the number of cases that the prosecutors feel would be successful if they took to court. So I'm really hoping there's this major knock-on effect. And a big deterrent actually for perpetrators to commit these kinds of heinous crimes, and hopefully also generate a bit of discussion within our communities about what is consent, and what does it mean to give consent or ask for consent.
Yeah. Oh, wow. 100%, man. Just because I don't kick and scream. Listen, if I said no, it's no, right? No means no. It's essentially, what more do you need me to do? And so 100%. Listen, Leanne, as this continues to unfold, hopefully it won't take 2 years, man. But as this definitely unfolds, you and I will stay in contact, and hopefully we'll get updates as this continues to move along and officially gets made law as we go forward. But for now, thank you for the good fight that you're fighting. Thank you to you. Thank you to the Embrace Project. Thank you for this, man. It is essential. The fact that we are now able to talk about this, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. So thank you for you, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show. Look forward to telling you about the confirmation.
100%. Thank you so much. That was Leanne, director and co-founder of the Embrace Project, doing absolutely amazing work.